Do you find it difficult sometimes to understand what people are saying? I'll be back in a minute and I'll share some thoughts on that again with you. As I remind my readers from time to time, it's very difficult for a person to understand the teachings of an enlightened spiritual teacher when that teacher is teaching at a higher level of consciousness than that of the student. I personally experienced this challenge reading Bernadette Roberts' book, The Path to No-Self. If you've read this wonderful book on non-dual thinking, you'll know what I'm talking about. Now, I have no problem admitting that some of her teaching went over my head, but here's a brief summary of what I did learn from her book. Basic concept number 1. Non-duality is the primary spiritual practice that will guide those on the spiritual path toward an authentic spiritual growth and enlightenment. In other words, non-duality or non-dual thinking is not the spiritual goal. It's the path that one will need to walk if your goal is awakening to the presence of God. Concept number 2. Authentic spiritual growth is essentially learning to walk the non-dual path or non-dual thinking, walking that path towards an emptiness of ego called no-self. Concept number 3. Only non-duality has the power to free us from dualistic thinking, or the prison of our self-focused ego. And most importantly, concept number 4, she reminds us that until the level of ego emptiness called no-self has been achieved, God will remain an object or other, not a sustainable experience of ultimate mystery. So to incorporate her teachings into ideas more useful for me, and I hope for my readers, I equated her unitive state or path of non-duality or non-dual thinking as the spiritual decision to adopt a middle path spirituality or middle path consciousness. A middle path spirituality is nothing more than a spiritual path that has nothing to do with religious doctrines, religious beliefs, religious creeds, or the need to embrace any of the teachings contained in the world's sacred text as, quote, absolute truth. A middle path spirituality is simply the authentic spirituality that emerges when we adopt a level of consciousness that embraces the intentional decision to search for and then embrace the contradictory truths that are always found on both sides of every issue. And doing that without having to label one side as right and the other side as wrong. In other words, dualistic thinking. When we choose the middle path spirituality that results from non-dual kind of thinking, we're simply choosing to intentionally drop the dualistic categories of right and wrong, good and bad. Those categories, by the way, that are so treasured by our emotionally driven childhood primitive ego. Over time, the dualistic need to take sides, to judge, and to compare everything will begin to drop away, and a sense of compassion for those on both sides of every issue or every conflict will begin to emerge. When we've traveled the non-dual path long enough to have tamed our ego's knee-jerk need to emotionally react to everything, Roberts says we will increasingly find our soul moving deeper and deeper into the peaceful, non-dual silence of the middle path, and a growing ability to simply be in the moment. She reminds us that that middle path experience will develop for us a sense of peace deep enough for our soul to experience the ultimate mystery that we call God. For Roberts, choosing to live a unitive life of non-dual thinking is a spiritual decision, a choice that one has to make if the spiritual goal is ego emptiness of no self and the creation of a spiritually enlightened consciousness. Regardless of how we choose to describe the mystery of ultimate reality, the mystery of God, until we've achieved enlightenment or total emptiness of ego, called no self, we will never be able to experience God as anything other than object or other. Roberts cautions that understanding and intellectually adopting a middle path non-dual consciousness is one of the easiest spiritual decisions a person can make. But achieving a true non-dual way of looking at the world can be a very difficult way of being to sustain in the marketplace of our day-to-day life. She warns us that once you have made the decision to embrace a middle path non-dual way of thinking and have begun the spiritual journey toward authentic sense of no self, the world will find it very difficult to understand you. The values of the world, or the marketplace as she calls it, will no longer have meaning or importance for you. You'll increasingly not care how others perceive you. As a result, people will probably begin to experience you as dangerous or even weird. She reminds the reader that once Jesus began teaching non-duality to his disciples and those who would listen to him, he only survived 3 years. When you've achieved non-dual thinking, the inevitable conflict and violence that results from the dualistic need to take sides and be right won't make sense to you any longer. The sense of peace that comes from non-dual thinking will become more important to your soul than the emotional satisfaction your ego self used to get by taking sides and judging. In the words of Bernadette Roberts and other enlightened spiritual teachers, when we've consciously chosen to drop right and wrong religious beliefs and opened our mind to non-duality or non-dual thinking, our authentic spiritual growth toward enlightenment and true spiritual awakening will have begun. I don't claim to understand all of Roberts' teachings, but after reading The Path to No Self, my spiritual journey toward a more non-dual way of thinking took an important step towards non-duality that's been my calling for many, many years.